Good afternoon. Welcome to Talks at Google in Cambridge, Mass. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Mezrich. Ben is one of the rare nonfiction authors like Michael Lewis, whose books not only have the urgency of compelling fiction, but which become part of the zeitgeist. We immediately think of Bringing Down the House, which became the movie 21, and The Accidental Billionaires, which became The Social Network, among many others. Ben joins us today to talk about his 17th, is that correct? Yes, hooray, 17th book, Once Upon a Time in Russia, The Rise of the Oligarchs, a true story of ambition, wealth, betrayal, and murder. It's also destined to become part of our national conversation, a story of two men who amassed vast riches after the breakup of the Soviet Union and what happened to them then. Spoiler alert, murder is in the title. The book has already been optioned for the movies by Warner Brothers and Brett Ratner's production company, and unlike the thousands of times where we say, oh yeah, it's been optioned, this is actually going to be made into a movie, believe it. So look for it on the big screen before too long. And please join me in welcoming Ben Mezrich.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi. Thanks very much. My new book is Once Upon a Time in Russia, but I figured I would talk a little bit about how I got here in the previous books, because I always, when you go to see a band and they won't play any of their big hits, only the new one, you always get pissed off. So I want to talk a little bit about the older works. I never really set out to be a journalist or a nonfiction writer. I actually always hated nonfiction growing up. I was a big television junkie when I was little, and I would watch the worst TV shows like Saved by the Bell and Three's Company. And my parents, fearing the worst, wanted me to start reading books, so they made a rule when I was little that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So at the age of 12 or 13, I became a speed reader. I would read everything, and by the time I was graduating college, I realized I wanted to be a writer. So I graduated, I went to Harvard, I lived in Boston, and I was a big fan of Bret Easton Ellis and Jay McInerney at the time, which is actually a big mistake when you want to be a writer, because then I attempted to be one of them, and I wrote 9 novels in the year I graduated from college that were all deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City. And consequently was rejected by everyone in publishing. I got about 190 rejection slips over a year, and I used to tape them to all the walls in my apartment. I looked like a serial killer surrounded by rejection. But eventually I wrote a book that was a little better than the rest. It was a medical thriller, because it was the dawn of ER, and George Clooney was really big then, and everybody was talking about ER. So my dad is a doctor, so I wrote a medical thriller called Threshold, which none of you have ever heard of, but it was my first book, which got me a second book, which was called Reaper, which again, none of you ever heard of, which was about a computer virus that made the jump to the biological world, and people started getting sick from their television sets, and was made into a very bad TV movie called Fatal Error, which still airs on the Sci-Fi Channel at like 2 in the morning. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. It stars Antonio Sabato Jr., remember him, the underwear model? I think he was on Melrose Place for a while, and he played a surgeon, which was very believable casting. I didn't know surgeons did so many sit-ups in between all their patients, but I remember watching this movie with my dad, who was a doctor again, and there's a scene where Antonio Sabato Jr. is leaning over a patient's chest, and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad turned to me and goes, that's in the head, right? So it was the quality of the work at the time. But I kept on going, and I actually ended up meeting some of the X-Files producers, and they asked me to come write for the X-Files. At the time, I didn't drive, so I didn't want to move to LA and become an LA writer. So I wrote a book called Skin, which stars Mulder and Scully. So if any of you are real X-Files fans, you might have seen this book. But it was about a skin transplant gone bad. And this professor gets a skin transplant from a murderer and starts murdering people. And Mulder and Scully track the skin back to Thailand, where I had never been. So I wrote the whole book from a Fyodor's guidebook. Google didn't exist back then, so it was pre-Google, I think. And it was, showed what I was doing. And it wasn't until I met these MIT kids. So I was hanging out at a bar, Crossroads, which a lot of you probably know Crossroads, which is that bar across the river. And there was a group of MIT kids that used to hang out there. And I was introduced to them. And they were like your regular MIT kids. They were kind of geeky. Most of them were Asian. But but they had tons of money, and it was all in $100 bills. And the thing is, in Boston, you never see $100 bills anywhere. In New York, you see $100 bills a lot. In Vegas, they come out of the ATM machines. But in Boston, you never see $100 bills. And so I went up to the main guy. In the book, I called him Kevin Lewis. In reality, his name was Jeff Ma. When I was writing the book, he didn't want to be known as the blackjack guy. And then when we made the movie 21, he did want to be known as the blackjack guy, so now I use his real name. I went up to Jeff, and I was like, why do you have all this money? And he said, well, come to my apartment. I want to show you something. And I went, and he had this really nice apartment for a guy his age in the South End. And he shows me his laundry, and in his laundry was $250,000 in stacks of hundreds. So immediately I think, okay, this guy's got to be a drug dealer, right? Because who has this much cash in their laundry? But he didn't seem like a drug dealer. He's a really geeky guy, and he was really nice. And basically, he invited me to Vegas the next day. And so I went on the plane with him, and 5 of his buddies flew with us, but they all pretended they didn't know each other, and everyone was sitting in different seats. And we landed in Vegas, and there's this limo waiting with this driver, and he's like, Mr. Lewis, your car is ready. And that wasn't even this guy's name, so this is pretty bizarre. And we went to this huge suite in Vegas. We had like a swimming pool and a butler. We didn't even know what to do with a butler. We had a butler. And all the MIT kids show up and start pulling money out from under their clothes. And they stacked it up on a table, and they said, we're the MIT blackjack team. And so I had kind of heard of something called the MIT blackjack team. No one had ever written about it yet. There'd never been a TV show about it. I thought it was like a math class where you learned how to play blackjack. But the reality was this had been going on for 25 years at MIT. And a group of students would train the next group of students. And essentially this group of 6 kids had made over $6 million playing blackjack. And I was blown away, and it was better than all of the crap I'd been writing, but it was true. So I essentially became a nonfiction writer to write that story. And I'm not going to go too much into it. We could go into it if people want to know, but you've seen the movie 21, or a lot of you had. It was pretty much that, 10 college kids hitting a casino. Card counting is actually something fairly simple. The idea is that blackjack is a beatable game because blackjack has a memory, which means that the deck changes as you play, which is different than roulette. Doesn't matter how many times you spin red, it's not going to change your chances of getting a red or a black. But in blackjack, if all the aces come out of a deck, you can't get blackjack. So the odds do change as you play, and there is a time when the player has an advantage. And that's when there are more high cards still in the deck. So all that card counting is watching the cards, waiting until more low cards have come out, more high cards are still in, and then you raise your bet. And that's what it is. The problem is the casino frowns upon it. They don't want you doing this. They don't want you using your brain in a casino. So if you get caught doing this, you get kicked out or worse. The MIT team would spread college kids out across the campus, out across the casino, one kid sitting at each table, keeping track of the cards. He would signal in the guy called the big player who comes in, bets $10,000 here, $10,000 there, is only betting on good decks. So you're essentially winning a higher percentage of all those hands. And then when you get the signal it's no longer good, you just keep walking around the casino. And so this system works pretty well until eventually you do get caught. They start tracking one of these big players and realize this guy's always winning. And they actually followed them back to Boston, these private eyes. They got a hold of all these yearbooks, and they took all the photos out of anybody who'd gone to MIT in a 10-year period and used it in all the facial recognition software that the casinos use. So if you had gone to MIT in a 10-year period and were betting big, an alarm would go off in the security booth. And that's how they eventually cracked the MIT blackjack team. So moving forward, I wrote this story up. I wrote an article for Wired magazine, and the book was about to come out, and Kevin Spacey read the article. And I was sitting at home, and the phone rings, and it's Kevin Spacey. And he's like, I want to talk to Ben Mezrich. And I was like, it's not really Kevin Spacey. I hung up on him, I remember. And I called my mom, and I was like, I think Kevin Spacey's trying to call me. And she said, no, it's MIT kids prank calling you, because they used to prank call me all the time. But really, it was Kevin. I went out, and he said, I want to make a movie out of this. And we actually sent it out to all of the studios, and everyone rejected it except for MGM, which was the same casino system that we had been hitting with the MIT blackjack team. And so it turned out they wanted to get some of their money back. They were really psyched to make it. The movie premiere was about to happen, and we were doing this big premiere in Vegas for 21. And I was sitting at home, and basically I got a random email at 2 in the morning. And it was an email from a Harvard senior. And it said, my best friend founded Facebook, and no one's ever heard of him. And so this was before Facebook was big. It was big. It was 100 million members. And I knew about Facebook because I've seen it. My wife was on it, and she kept putting pictures up of parties that I didn't know, we had gone to, and I'd see all these pictures. And I was like, this is interesting. I'd heard of Mark Zuckerberg, but I'd never heard of anybody else. So I went out for a drink, and it was in the Bar 10 at the Westin. I don't think that's still around, but if you remember that. And in walks Eduardo Saverin. And if you saw the movie The Social Network, he looked a lot like Andrew Garfield. Not as good looking as Andrew Garfield, but he was kind of a less good looking version of Andrew Garfield. And he proceeds to get really, really drunk. And he starts the conversation by saying, Mark Zuckerberg fucked me. And I thought that was kind of an interesting start to a conversation. And he began to tell me that story. And a lot of you have seen The Social Network because you kind of know this story. Two geeky guys who had a lot of trouble meeting girls. They were, Mark was a computer, really smart with computers. Eduardo had made a lot of money trading stocks, and his family was rich. And Eduardo had wanted to be a member of this finals club, the Phoenix, and got in. Mark couldn't get into a finals club, and instead he went on a date with a girl that went really bad. He got home, he drank a bunch of beers, and then hacked into all these computers at Harvard, got all these pictures of every girl on campus, and made a site where you could vote on who the hottest girl at Harvard was. At the time, he also had a little thing where you could compare the girls to farm animals. And when he got in trouble for this, he said, well, the girls were beating the farm animals, so he thought no one should be mad at him, but shows you the social state he was in at the time. Basically, he leaked this program out to a bunch of friends. It spread all over campus. It actually got him in a lot of trouble. He nearly got kicked out of Harvard. And that's when he caught the attention of the Winklevi twins. And you couldn't invent these guys if you wanted to, right? 6'5", identical twin Olympic rowers. They were the cool kids on campus. They always wore suits to class. I remember meeting them in a hotel room in New York. And Cameron or Tyler, I don't know which one, you can't tell them apart. He was like, you look at us and you think we've got to be the bad guys in this story. Because we look like the guys in an 80s movie who would be chasing the Karate Kid around dressed as skeletons, right? I remember I put that line into the book, and then Aaron Sorkin put that line into the movie. And then when the movie came out, Ralph Macchio actually called me and was excited that the Karate Kid was being talked about in this movie. So I thought that was cool. But the Winklevi saw Mark Zuckerberg, getting in trouble in all the papers for this website he had written. And they were working on their own website in their dorm room, which is what I loved about Harvard at that time period, is even the jocks were making computer programs in their dorm room. They were working on a dating website called the HarvardConnection.com. And the idea behind it was to help women meet Harvard men. Harvard men spent a lot of time trying to help women meet Harvard men. This was their idea. The problem is they didn't know anything about computers. So they wanted to hire someone that could make this program for them. They see Mark Zuckerberg in the newspaper, and they say, we're going to hire this guy. Now, Mark didn't think much of their idea. He thought it was stupid. He thought they were stupid. But he thought, hanging out with the cool guys on campus, that's cool, so I'm going to do that. So he basically led them on. He went to his friend Eduardo, his roommate, and basically said, Eduardo, I've got an idea for a website. People will put their own stuff up. We won't get in trouble. If you put up the money, and at the time it was $1,000, you can be CFO, and you can have 30% of the company. Now, it's two college kids in a dorm room. There's no lawyers. There's no contracts or anything like that. And Eduardo says, sure, here's $1,000. Mark locks himself in a room. He writes Facebook, and the rest is kind of history. It rolls out. Everyone at Harvard joins. It starts going from college to college. When it hits Stanford, that's when Sean Parker joins the story, the Justin Timberlake character. He was the cool kid of Silicon Valley. Some of you might know Sean. He dresses in Armani. He's got girls on his arms, but he also has like an EpiPen in his pocket because he's allergic to everything. So he's got that kind of mix of cool and geek going on. Eduardo thinks he's a snake oil salesman. Eduardo doesn't like Sean at all. Mark is totally into Sean. He idolizes Sean. Mark moves off to California. Eduardo stays behind. Sean ends up living with Mark in a house and basically is starting to take it to the next level. Eduardo feels like he's being left behind, gets very upset, and he freezes the bank accounts of Facebook. At this point, he'd put $18,000 into the company. He freezes it. So Sean takes Mark over to Peter Thiel and says, we need some money. And Peter Thiel gives them $500,000, but says, well, who's this guy listed as your CFO who's not even here? We need to get rid of this guy, basically. So they invite Eduardo out to California. Eduardo shows up and walks into a room full of lawyers. He thinks that they're his lawyers. They're actually Facebook's lawyers. He signs a document which dilutes him to zero. And then he goes back to Boston. The Winklevi, meanwhile, are off rowing in Henley in London or whatever, and they realize that Facebook is huge and they're not involved. They sue Mark. Eduardo sues Mark, and that's when I came into the story. Eduardo wasn't supposed to be talking to anybody. He was in the midst of this massive lawsuit. He was being ignored. He wasn't getting anywhere. So he thought by talking to a writer, he could maybe force Facebook to settle with him. I hung out with Eduardo. I wrote a 14-page book proposal, and my book proposal leaked onto the internet. It landed on a site called Gawker.com, and on that day, all hell broke loose. Facebook settled with Eduardo for what eventually became $4 billion. Part of the settlement agreement says you may never speak to Ben Mezrich again, because they were hoping to stop, the book from happening. So Eduardo, sends me a legal restraining order that I can never speak to him again, and runs off to Singapore, breaks up with the girl he was dating because she was my wife's best friend. And listen, I understand. For $4 billion, I would never speak to me again, too. I get it. But he disappeared, and I have not spoken to Eduardo ever since. Facebook comes to me and is like, what are you writing? All this kind of stuff. I start going back and forth with them that I want to talk to Mark. Mark let me interview. Mark would not let me interview him. He knew he couldn't control what I was going to write. He knew the Winklevi were talking to me, so he did not want any involvement with it, which is his right. Basically, Aaron Sorkin also saw this online and said, I want to write this as my next movie. David Fincher saw it online and says, I want to direct this as my next movie, which is all wonderful, except for I hadn't actually written a book yet. So I locked myself in a hotel room in Boston, and I wrote the book in about 3 months, and Sorkin came out, and he wrote the screenplay about 3 weeks after that, and it became The Social Network, which was awesome. Had it not been for the King's Speech, it would have won all the Oscars, which the King's Speech was very good, too. But anyways, this is where my career was at this point, and this is how we get to Once Upon a Time in Russia. Brett Ratner, the director, who did the Hercules movie, the Rush Hour movies, he was a producer on the movie 21, so I had known him through the years, and he would often call me with ideas for stories. Anything, they were always dangerous. They were always like gun runners in Miami, or people who had been selling drugs out of the back of their house or whatever, and I would say, Brett, how dangerous is this story? And he'd always say, it's like an 8 out of 10, and I said, I don't want to do an 8 out of 10. So anyways, 2 years ago, he calls me up again, and he says, listen, Ben, I got a story. It's really good. You need to come to London and meet some people. And he didn't tell me what it was. And I was like, oh, really going to fly all the way to London? He's like, trust me, it's a great story. So I flew to London. I landed in London. I went straight to this restaurant where we were meeting, and there were all these security people outside, like a dozen security, all these black Mercedes limousines. And I get in, and across the room was an oligarch, so a real Russian oligarch, someone that is very famous. And I walk in, I'm like, no fucking way. That was my first response. I was like, Fred, I don't want to be involved with this. This is too big. These people are very scary. It's this intense, huge story. But I sat down and I began to hear this story, and it was really mind-boggling. I mean, it's this incredible drama about these two men, Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich. And through them, you get the whole story of where Putin came from, the fall of communism and the rise of capitalism, and this incredible creation of wealth. At one point in time, 7 men owned 50% of Russia's GDP. And these were men from nowhere, with no backgrounds. They were poor, many of them were Jewish in an anti-Semitic society. They had built these incredible fortunes off of this chaotic, turbulent shift from communism to capitalism. So after going back and forth a number of times, I did decide to write it, and we ended up selling the movie and the book, and so the movie is going to be with Warner's. And just to give you a brief idea of the story, because I don't want to give too much of it away, because not everyone in the US knows these names that well, Boris Berezovsky was essentially a car salesman. In the early 90s, he was a mathematician by background, a brilliant man, but he was an outsider. He really didn't have anything behind him. He wasn't a member of a communist party. And when communism fell, capitalism was quickly shoved into place by Boris Yeltsin, who was the president. The idea was that there was this fear that communism would come back. So they wanted to quickly place all of the resources of Russia into the hands of private people, into businesses that were owned by private citizens, so that it became capitalism overnight. So essentially there was this free-for-all, and a man like Boris Berezovsky, who was very crafty and very smart, was able to find a way in. He became a car dealer who essentially became one of the wealthiest men in Russia by opening up car dealerships all over the country, and that's what he was doing. In 1994, he was in his car riding out of one of his companies when the car was blown up. He was nearly killed. His driver was decapitated. It was this assassination attempt. He actually caught fire, was able to survive, had a lot of bandages on him, and basically decided he needed to get into politics because the only way to protect yourself in Russia was to be a politician. So he wormed his way into the Kremlin and became part of the inner circle of Yeltsin, the family with a capital F. It was at this point that he met Roman Abramovich. He was on a yacht in the Caribbean, and Roman Abramovich was a 26-year-old toy maker. He used to make rubber ducks and babies' toys. Came from nowhere again, an orphan from Siberia, no background at all, and he was on this boat. He met Berezovsky, and he pitched him the idea of privatizing an oil company. Basically, there was all these pieces of an oil company owned by the Communist Party, essentially, that had to become private, and they decided that they would be the people who did it. So Boris Berezovsky became his roof. In Russia, the word is the krisha. You have a roof above you that protects you. It comes from the mafia, but it moved into politics and business. If you had someone above you protecting you, you could build a company. So again, just like the Facebook story, there were no shares changing hand, there were no contracts being signed. Berezovsky was in the Kremlin and would help out on that end, and Roman would do the legwork and be the businessman. And they built what became the second largest oil company in Russia, Sibneft. In this process, they got wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. Abramovich would have to make payments to Berezovsky, suitcases full of money. Those were the payments. They would show up with $3 million in a suitcase, $5 million in 2 suitcases, and these payments could come once a week, twice a week. One year, they ended up giving him $100 million. It was crazy amounts of money, wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. But at the same time, Yeltsin was getting ill. He was getting sick. And the people behind him, these oligarchs, realized that Yeltsin was going to die and they needed to put someone in his place, a new president. And that's where they found Vladimir Putin. Putin was this nobody. He was a low-level KGB agent in St. Petersburg. He worked for the mayor of St. Petersburg. He was known for being incredibly loyal. And that's all he really had going for him at the time. Nobody knew anything about him. But they wanted to place someone in power who was very loyal. And they figured this is a cog, this is someone we can control. So they essentially handpicked Putin and they made him president of Russia after Yeltsin. The minute he took over, everything changed. A week later, he invited these oligarchs to Stalin's old house. You could actually see bullet holes in the wall where people had been lined up and shot. The oligarchs were sat down at a table, and Putin got in front of them and said, listen, you've all made a lot of money, you've done very, very well, you can keep your money, but stay out of my way. And from that moment on, the oligarchs were given a signal. They had 2 choices. Keep your money and do whatever Putin says, or go against me and you'll either exiled or dead. And that's exactly what happened. Berezovsky went up against him and eventually ended up exiled to London. And then, well, I don't want to give too much away, but you really pretty much know this if you read any news. He's eventually found hanging a year ago. Meanwhile, Abramovich stays in, good with Putin, grows and grows and grows. He ends up offering Berezovsky $1.3 billion. He hands him a check for $1.3 billion on an airfield in France and says basically, here's your payoff, now you're finished. And Berezovsky took the money and then regretted it and sued Abramovich in the largest lawsuit in history for $6 billion in the legal courts and eventually lost the case and then was found hanging. So this is the story. It's really intense. It's really huge. Throughout the story, there's the character of Litvinenko, some of you might have heard of, the guy who was polonium poisoned a few years back. He actually moonlit. He worked as security for Berezovsky and also was a KGB agent under Putin. So he's a character that links all of these characters together. But in the end, he met his fate. He drank a cup of tea that was laced with polonium and died in a very horrible manner. On his deathbed, he blamed Putin, but there's a lot of mystery surrounding it, which I get into in the book a little bit more. In the end, the story was intense and crazy to write. I do remember one time Brett and I were sitting at a table with these people, and Brett goes, "Are we going to get killed for writing this?" And the oligarch goes, "You watch too many movies." And then Brett said, "Well, what if we say the wrong thing?" And he said, "Don't say the wrong thing." So it's as simple as that, right? So I figured at this point, I know this is it's a big story, but I tell it in a small way. If you read the book, it's a thriller, James Bond-esque a little bit, and all of it is true, built on these sources. But I figure I'd open it up to questions at this point. I know my career spans a number of topics that you may or may not be interested in, and I'd love to hear what anybody wants to know. So, sure.
So, hello. Yeah, the question was, you seem to stumble upon these amazing stories, or they are able to find you. I'm just wondering how you're so plugged in and are able to identify these things that other people just say, not a big deal.
Right. Well, I have all these criteria I look at before I get into a story. And I want to first make clear that I don't actually find these stories. They come to me. Ever since Bringing Down the House in 21 came out, every college kid who does something stupid emails me. Every college kid who does something cool also emails me. All of these stories started to come and be sent to me because of that movie and that book. The idea of a bunch of kids taking on a casino really caught something in the way people who don't love authority or are very smart and want to do things different think. So people come to me with stories, and I look into the story and I try and figure out not what's going to be hot or what's going to be a big story, but what is intriguing to me because it has these themes of like exotic locations, something using your brains. I don't want criminals. I want someone to do something through ambition, but is super smart and figures out a way to game the system. All of my books have that theme. And Mark Zuckerberg really, he changed a system that didn't work for him. You know, he was a geeky guy who couldn't meet girls, as much as he denies that. That's really what his story was. And he wanted to create a world where people like him could be socially stars. And he created Facebook to make a social world that worked for Mark Zuckerberg. The oligarchs saw an opportunity. They were incredibly ambitious and smart. They were willing to kill people, but they essentially built these fortunes because they looked at this crumbling system and said, I know a way to win here. And so I'm always intrigued by that. So it's not that I'm trying to guess what's going to be the next hot thing or is this going to work for a big audience. I do, however, never start a book if I don't think there can be a movie. Because I feel like if it can't be a movie, it's probably not going to be a good book. I know there's a lot of writers who don't think that way and probably don't like me thinking that way, but I do feel like the stories I choose, they work because they could also be on the screen. They are very cinematic. They have those Shakespearean dramatic themes to them. So I really look for those criteria when I'm trying to find something to write. But yeah. It's tricky. I mean, you never know what's going to work and what's not going to work when you sit down. So I remember when I wrote the Facebook book, I sent it to Kevin Spacey and Dana Brunetti, who runs his company, and one of their first comments was, yeah, it works as a book, but I don't know if I see this as a movie. And my mom said the same thing. She's one of my first readers always, and she's like, yeah, no one cares about Facebook. And you know, maybe no one did care about Facebook, but suddenly they did when it was presented in the right way. So it's just a matter of figuring out, you know, these themes that really send a story forward. Yeah, sure. Anybody? Yeah.
So with Russia getting isolated with sanctions, with the standoff over Ukraine,
Right.
there is a kind of general sentiment / hope that the oligarchs might push Putin away from that course. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually think there's a misconception about Putin and the oligarchs. In the olden days, yes, the oligarchs ran the country. There were 7 men who owned 50% of the GDP. They propped Yeltsin up. They created Putin. But everything flipped. Putin is above the oligarchs. Now, it's not that the oligarchs are going to gather together and get rid of Putin. Putin gets rid of the oligarchs. And I think there's a misconception in the West about Putin, how strong he is. He's very strong. The people in Russia love him. The oligarchs who have stayed in control and power love Putin. They're known as Putin's cash register. When he wants money, he asks for it, and they give it to him. So the idea that sanctioning Russia is going to make the oligarchs take Putin down is incorrect. It's going to make Putin react violently in a lot of different ways because he's a very strong leader. He believes very strongly that Russia shouldn't be under the control of the rest of the world. So I don't see that happening personally. I mean, I guess I could be wrong. I'm not a Russian expert in a lot of things other than this particular story. I really feel that backed into a corner, Putin becomes stronger and lashes out more. So I don't know what the answer is there. I do think that economically the country is being hurt badly. The oil prices going down is dramatically destroying oligarchs' wealth as well as the Russian wealth. But Putin's power base seems to be getting stronger, not weaker. The oligarchs who go up against him don't end up well, right? They end up dead, or they end up broke, or they end up in prison. And that continues. I don't know how that changes. You see a lot of oligarch money coming into New York and London. The reason is the oligarchs are afraid of what's going on in Russia, not for Putin, but for themselves. They think, okay, I'm going to go buy a $100 million house in New York so that I'll have money when I have to get out of there. It's not the other way around. It's not, let's take this money and take Putin down. So I don't know that that is the right way to look at it. I know that that is what people want to happen. But in the real world, Putin is a very popular man in Russia. He's more popular than any president we've ever had. And that's not because they're forced to vote for him. People love a strong leader in a strong country. And that's what they look to Putin for. So that's my opinion. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on that, so there are people who will say differently, but that's what I think is happening.
I just wanted to ask, in writing this most recent book, Once Upon a Time in Russia, did you have a chance to personally interact with some of the oligarchs?
I did. I don't go into who my sources are specifically. I definitely had first readers who read every line in this book who were involved very heavily in the story. So there were at least one oligarch involved. A lot of people who work, I will say this is the first book I've written where I didn't want to uncover anything that I wasn't already known. I wasn't like, I want to find some secret tie between Litvinenko's murder and somebody in particular, because that wouldn't necessarily be good. But in general, I had some amazing sources. I also had all these incredible court documents. There were all these depositions taken in this trial between Berezovsky and Abramovich. Depositions all the way to Putin's head of staff. Abramovich is deposed for 1,000 pages in there. And I received this document, and I don't know how much of this trial was public and how much of it wasn't, but I was at a meeting of these Russians, and a man came up behind me and put something into my pocket. And he said, "Don't look at it till you get to your room." And I went back to my hotel and I put it in the computer, and it was the entire trial and all the depositions. And then I had to fly home to the US with this, and I was like, is this even something I'm supposed to have? I have no idea. But I didn't get arrested. So anyways, it was an amazing story, and I did have access to a lot of really great information. But in general, I'm not really naming sources in this one.
Okay, I guess just a more general question about it then. About the sources you did have,
Yes.
how were they as people?
Yes, you know what? Very pleasant. I get blamed for this a lot. I love the people I write about in every book. I think it was Janet Maslin who said I'm like the evil billionaire's best friend. But the reality is that I like people, and I like people who are open. And what I like most about people like this is that they're not fake. You know what? You see right up front who these people are. There's no lying going on. They tell you exactly how they made their money and where they got it from. And hearing the stories like that, it was an amazing thing. So in general, I actually got along well with them. There was one person I was working with for a long time, and then as I did more research, I was like, holy crap, this guy was like a heavy. This guy was a tough guy. But in person, very kind and very smart, and I learned a lot. For the most part, these are very smart, ambitious people who were living in a very wild West. They call it the Wild East society, where there weren't the same sort of rules you have in the West in business. They said, don't look at the 90s in Russia like the 90s in America. Look at the 90s in Russia like the 1890s in America, where people were shooting each other on the street. This was a world in which if you were the CEO of a company and the CEO of another company came against him and you killed him, you got his company. That doesn't happen in American business. There's a board of directors, it doesn't get you the company. But in Russia at the time, it did get you the company. There's a great story in the book, and this is all true, where the oil company that they were building, they needed what's called a red director, which was a communist leader of a piece of a company, to okay the deal they were making. So they went to meet with this guy in Siberia. He's an old world communist guy, and it was Abramovich and Berezovsky. Berezovsky had lunch with him, and they said, we need you to okay this deal. And this guy said, no, I'm not going to okay this deal. So they went back to Moscow. That night, that man went swimming in the Irkutsk River in the middle of Siberia, drowned. His bodyguard, who was the only witness, got into a bar fight and died. And then the deal went through. So I hear this story, and I'm like, well, that sounds a little shady, right? And the guy goes, yes, it was much trouble for us. Everyone assumed we had him killed. I mean, it's, I don't know. But that was the story, and, he went and he drowned. It happens. He was, the way they described it, he was a big man, he was macho, he had these girls with him, he wanted to impress them, he jumped in the water, it was cold, he had a heart attack. It happens. So the story is there, it's an incredible story, but in the scope of this story, this happened over and over and over again, where the person in your way died. Something would happen. And it was a lesson, but everyone kind of knew the game they were playing. That's the other thing about this. Nobody was a businessman in Russia in the 90s and didn't realize that this is how this game worked. They all had security of 50, 60 men. Every company had a division of wet works whose job it was to deal with security issues. Anything from protecting a CEO to bashing up a showroom of another company. So that's how business was working in the 90s. It was very corrupt and chaotic. And Abramovich had a great quote in the trial where they asked him about this, and he said, well, this was the world we were in. I mean, this was how it worked. Was it corrupt? Was it chaotic? Sure. But we were all businessmen in a world with these sorts of rules. So your choice was to be a businessman or not be a businessman. So I actually am intrigued by that. I could never do anything like that. I'm scared of everything. But the idea, to me, is these were very upfront, ruthless people working in a very ruthless, upfront society. So I don't know. There's something appealing to me about that.
Do you multitask at all? I mean, so when you work on this project, do you have things lined up?
I have a lot of projects going on at the same time, more than one should have. I have 4 movies in development, a television show with FX and Jerry Bruckheimer based on my book, Ugly Americans. Some of you might have heard of this book about expats living in Asia and the Japanese sex underground, but it's also about bankers in Tokyo in around 2000, although we're updating it, so it's like Entourage in Asia now. But the show is going to be called, I don't know what it's going to be called, but it's based on my book, Ugly Americans. So I'm working on multiple projects, and then this book, and then another project as well. So I do have a lot going on. I try and focus, for until something is done and then move to the next one. But in general, it's impossible because if you have multiple things going. So yeah, I multitask a lot. But it's more like just crazed, wild, this and this and this and this. It's not a controlled multitasking. I'm not like one of those people who keeps a book and at this 15 minutes I'm doing this and this 15 minutes and that. I should be one of those people. But instead I'm just doing this and oh shoot, I have to do that. Oh shoot, I have to do that. And then somehow it all gets done. I don't recommend this form of working for anybody, but this is what I do. Yeah, sure.
So there's this point in your story that I seems like there's a lacuna that I don't quite believe. It begins with, so you meet Ma in a bar.
Yes.
And I knew people who knew some of these people back at MIT. They didn't just like tell everybody in the bar what they did. So there was some conversation you had, and then
right.
you said, "Oh, come back to my." So like somehow like yeah, you just and then these people tell you all their secrets. So I'm curious what you can tell us about that.
I'm very ingratiating, first of all. I think people in general. I don't go in with a notebook or a tape recorder and get people to tell me their stories. First of all, it's people who want to tell their stories. People come to me all the time and say, what would make a great story? FIFA, all the craziness in FIFA. Well, yeah, that would make a great story, but I need a guy who wants to tell this story. And Jeff was a guy who wanted to tell this story. I met Jeff through the girl on the team who introduced me to them. She was the one that Kate Bosworth ended up playing in the movie, Jane. She's here in Boston too. She's at Ropes and Gray and a big-time lawyer now. And she was dating one of the MIT blackjack members. Now, I didn't know that. I didn't know that she was a blackjack player. She was actually one of the best blackjack players, and she basically ended up saying, you got to meet these guys. So I met them, saw all the money, and then started following Jeff around. Jeff wanted to tell his story. It wasn't like twisting his arm. Although there was a point right before the book came out that suddenly he realized this was going to happen. He was like, let's just cancel this. I don't want to do this anymore. And I was like, Jeff, this is coming out in a week. You don't have a choice anymore, Jeff. But I do become friends with these characters. I become part of their lives. As I said, Eduardo was dating my wife's best friend, and we were hanging out. That's how I write my stories. So when someone pitches me a story, I'm also trying to figure out how close to this person can I get. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, it becomes an awful situation where you're with someone for a long time and you realize this is going to go bad somewhere along the way. But that's the way I write my stories, is I become a part of it. I join into whatever group it is I'm writing about. With the Russian oligarchs, it was much trickier. I got along very well with a lot of the people I was working with, but in the back of your head, you're thinking, well, what have these people done? Who are these people really? But in general, I try and find a way to get inside their head and get very close to them. And so in the end, they really want to talk. And I will say the movie thing helps a lot. Almost everyone wants to see themselves in a movie. Everyone thinks that their story needs to be on the screen. And a lot of people's story could be on the screen. And so essentially, when I go into it, people know that there's a chance it could be a movie. They'll be more talkative and more open. Other people, of course, immediately clam up. People who are don't want their story told will suddenly, and I know when that's going to happen. I'm like, okay, this person's not going to talk to me. But the MIT team that I worked with, they all really wanted their story out there. So, yeah. Sure.
You mentioned oligarchs trying to put their money in safe places, such as New York real estate. And before the talk, you said something which seemed particularly fascinating, which is American movies. Is
yeah.
a particularly big focus for Oligarchs?
Yeah, so Brett knows a lot of these guys personally, which is how we got into the story. There's a lot of Russian money in Hollywood. There are people who with enormous amounts of money, and not just the oligarchs with their billions, but multi-millionaires from Russia who want to make movies. And the honest truth is that Hollywood will take money from anybody. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. If you're willing to put a few $1 million into a movie that will probably not make any money, you're welcome. You can be a producer. So a lot of money is coming in from Russia into Hollywood. And so that's, where this story probably was connected into. But yes, there's a lot of money going into a lot of industries. I mean, listen, there's hundreds of these billionaires essentially now from countries like Russia and China and the Middle East whose countries are not that safe. So where are they going to put their money? They're going to move it all here, which makes it hard for regular people to buy apartments in Boston now, right? But that's essentially where all this money is coming from. Yes.
So now that you have a personal connection to the Brooklyn Nets, I hope that you'll be moving into sports stuff. And I'm sure you're hard at work on the FIFA scandal right now. That'd be the obvious next project. I actually have two questions. I hope that's okay. One is, and actually one question is a little obliquely related to this. People often put you and Michael Lewis in the same category. Jonathan did when he introduced you. There's some obvious similarities there, although Michael Lewis's subjects seem a little more staid than a lot of yours. But I'm just wondering if you have any kind of relationship at all with Michael, or have ever thought about doing anything collaborative. And that leads me to the second question, which is I'm not clear. Have you ever done any actual screenwriting? And would you want to do that? Have you tried it? Do you do it? That's certainly an area where people often collaborate with each other. But anyway, those are my two questions.
Yeah,
Michael Lewis and screenwriting.
Yeah, so Michael Lewis, first of all, one of the greatest writers around today, and he has Wall Street covered so well that I can't do Wall Street unless I find something he wouldn't touch. I think he's amazing. I'm very competitive and sad that he's so much more successful than me. I think Michael's brilliant. He's a genius. I've never worked with him. I've never met him. He's my younger brother's favorite author, which bothers me to no end. Every time I write a book, my little brother calls me and goes, "It's good, but it's no Michael Lewis." So it kind of, but he's amazing, and I would love to work with him. I just don't, know how that would ever come about. In terms of screenwriting, I've written one screenplay for my book, Ugly Americans. I had written it for 2929 or DreamWorks at the time, can't remember. Didn't get made, and now it's being made in a show, so I'm not writing that. I will write screenplays, but I'll always be a book writer. I love the idea of doing a screenplay, and I probably will do it. I think the process is very tough and in many ways demeaning. You write it, and there's a whole committee of people that work with you and change it and change it and change it and change it, and then it never gets made. There's hundreds of working screenwriters who make good livings who've never had a movie made, and that would be incredibly frustrating to me. With a book, you write the book. For better or worse, you control it. It comes out. Whether people buy it or not, you don't have a lot of control over, but it's your project, and then they can make a movie out of it. I will do screenplays. I'd like to adapt some of my own projects. In general, Hollywood does not want you to do that. When you sell a project, they want to attach an A-list screenwriter to it. And that's the quickest way a movie gets made. So you usually say yes, because the goal is to get a movie made. If I wanted to, I could say, no, I want to write it. They would say, sure, they let me write it, and then they would hire a screenwriter. So usually that's what happens. But I will eventually try my hand in a bigger way in screenwriting. I think it's a very different format. You don't get all the interior dialogue. You don't get a lot of the stuff that you get in a book. But on the other hand, my books are always, for better or worse, called cinematic. I think my very first book review, when I was 25 years old, in the New York Times, it said, "This is a bad book. Someone should make it into a movie." So I think from the very beginning, I've always been seen as someone who writes books that could be movies. So eventually, I probably will do more screenplays. But also the reality is I never want to leave Boston. I love this city. This is where I live. And to be a working screenwriter, eventually you end up in LA. And that's not for me. I love LA for a week, but beyond that, I got to come back to Boston. So yeah, so far so good. And Michael Lewis, listen, anytime he wants to do something, I'm here. But he's great. I think he's an amazing writer. So yeah. Anybody else? Question? Sure.
Which work are you most proud and why?
Yeah, I would say, Once Upon a Time in Russia, I think is in many ways, my first adult book. It's my first book of a serious topic that, I did an interview for the BBC the other day, and they're like, so tell me about Glasnost. And I was like, holy shit, what did I do? I can't tell anybody about Glasnost. But I think Bringing Down the House was the book that was most amazing to me. It changed my life. I was out in Vegas. I wrote this. It was my first nonfiction book, and it did very well. So that was a book I'm very proud of. I think Ugly Americans, is a great story. Japan was amazing. I spent a month over there and was just blown away by it, and I thought that was a lot of fun to write. I wrote a book called Sex on the Moon, which we're still trying to make into a movie about a kid who stole moon rocks from NASA, and it's a really wild catch me if you can type of story, where he stole a 600-pound safe full of moon rocks from every moon landing in history, and he spread them on a bed and had sex with his girlfriend on the moon, and then tried to sell the moon rocks over the internet. And it's this wild, bizarre, true story. He ended up spending 10 years in prison for what to him was like a college prank. And then the day he got out of prison, he called me. And he was like, I want to tell you a story. And I was meeting this guy who'd just been in prison a decade, and I was like all scared. And he's like the nicest guy, super smart. He was on his way to being an astronaut and had just done something really stupid. And I was kind of just interested in that, and I think that book came together very well. So Sex on the Moon was a good one. But yeah, I think that people will like Once Upon a Time in Russia. I think it's going to make an awesome movie. So hopefully, that's a project that people will look at and like. But sure. Anybody else? Sure.
So you mentioned Once Upon a Time in Russia as your first adult book or sort of serious topic.
Yeah.
Are you hoping anything comes of it beyond a movie and people reading it? Are you hoping that will cause any changes here in Russia or anything like that?
Well, listen, I do want to preface this by saying, first of all, that this is probably the most pro-Putin book you're going to read from an American author around now this time. Because in the scope of this story, Putin is not the bad guy. He came to this country at a time when everything was falling apart. Oligarchs had all this wealth and money. Nobody knew what to do with capitalism. And he took power basically saying, no more taking the money out of this country. This country is going to get great and strong and powerful again, and I'm going to wipe out anybody who says no to that. So in the scope of the story, he's not he's not the bad guy. But I will say, do I want anything serious to happen because of this book? That's a good question. I don't ever sit down and think, how is this going to affect the world? Am I going to change policy? Is anything going to happen because of this? I just don't take myself that seriously in general. I write thrillers, I write fun, entertaining stories. I do think people will get a better perception of Putin, a better, more real perception of how this all happened by reading this book. Because you really don't see a lot in the news about where he came from. You really don't see a lot in the news about why he's so powerful or why these oligarchs are all in London. And I feel like this is the first time this story is told in this way, or at least in a big way. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the solution to all the problems in Russia. It's such a complicated issue, the world as it is now, and how Russia's dealing with the Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. I just think reading this book will help people have a better understanding of that period in time, the 90s. But no, for me, it's really entertainment. In the end, I'm an entertainer, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so connected to that, do you think that when it goes from your book to your movie, the general sort of sentiment is preserved? And do you think it will be in this movie about Putin and Russia?
Yeah, great question. So for me, I sell the project, and I hope I sell it to the people who will make the best movie out of it. Because once you sell it as an author, you're on the lowest part of the totem pole. You're below the caterer. You're not important, and they want you to hang out there and sit at the bar and hang out with the actors and then go away. I always say the producer's favorite author is a dead author, because then they don't have to deal with them. So in general, I've been very lucky. I thought 21 was really fun. A lot of people say the book was more serious, blackjacky, and the movie was more fluffy, but I think the movie 21 was kind of perfect for what it was. Every 21-year-old kid watched it on the way to Vegas. It was fun, it was exciting, and I thought Spacey was great. And then The Social Network was brilliant. I mean, Sorkin and Fincher did an amazing thing with that story, beyond anything I could have hoped for. So I've been very fortunate. I didn't have a lot of control. I was consulting. I talked a lot on the set to everyone involved and was involved in that respect, but I didn't have any real control over anything. But sooner or later, a bad movie will be made from one of my books. I believe that this is going to be a very good movie. We've got a lot of really amazing people who are interested in doing it right now. So I don't know yet who the specific director or writer will be, but I know the people in contention are phenomenal. So I do think this will be a very big project. I think it's at Warner's now, and Warner's will make the decision of very shortly of who's going to write and direct it. And I think it's going to move very quickly. So I do think it's going to be good. But you know, it's early, and you never really know. And we'll see what happens. I've been lucky. I know I've been lucky. I have a lot of friends in the business who've had movies made of their books that didn't come out so well. And The Social Network is just one of those crazy situations where suddenly you have this Oscar-winning movie based on Facebook. I mean, who knew, right? So it's something that worked out. Yeah. Sure.
I'm a little intrigued by what you said just recently, that you just write to entertain.
Yes.
In our book club, we read another story about Russia by this guy, Bill Browder.
Yeah.
Red Notice. And I was struck by how he, from a Wall Street money-making guy, went to Russia, did all this stuff, and then when his lawyer gets jailed, decided completely to change his life.
Right.
To write a book, to go to Congress and actually get his act passed.
Right.
So how have these stories kind of changed you?
Yeah.
I hope that you don't say, no, I just write.
Well, his story is fascinating and incredible, and I think, he's a very brave man who went through something intense, and, his lawyer was murdered, died in prison, and then he wrote that book as a way of protest, in a way, to really make something happen. He and I are very different. This is my 17th book, right? I write books because the story compels me, and it's fascinating, it's interesting and intriguing. I live vicariously through the characters. I wanted to be the MIT kid taking on Vegas. I wanted to be Mark Zuckerberg. I wanted to be an oligarch while I was writing the book. The idea is fascinating to me. So yes and no. Does it change me? I mean, while I have to explain me a little bit, and I know this is a weird thing to say, but I'm a very neurotic, bizarre person, and in my regular life, I'm like a hermit. I don't really want to go outside. I live in the mall, and I don't ever leave the mall. I'm like a very, pale, tiny little creature. And yet when I write a book, I become a part of it. I live this incredibly amazing life where I'm flying around in private jets, and I'm in Sean Parker's limo for the night, and I'm in running around like whatever character I'm writing about. I'm hanging out in, Yakuza bars in Osaka. And so I live like the characters for that period in time when I'm writing the book. And then the book ends and I go back to me. So no, in a way, the books don't affect who is me. But during the process of writing the book, I become whatever it is I'm writing about. I know it sounds strange. I always worshipped Hunter S. Thompson, and I wanted to be Hunter S. Thompson. But I wanted to be him without the drugs and the guns and the suicide. I was like the safe version of him. And I feel like by compartmentalizing my life, that's what I do. So I can become him for a little bit, and then I go back to my regular life. So yeah, in a way, it's sad because there's no personal growth. But on the other hand, there's lots of moments of personal growth, and then I quickly pull back into who I am. So I guess that's the answer, which may not be what you're looking for, but it's kind of what works for me. And that's why, this book has been a phenomenal experience, and then I move on to the next project. It's not, yeah. If that makes sense. But yeah, sure.
What is your next story?
Yeah, the next story. So, I'll be on tour for this for a little while for the next few weeks, and I have a book I just sold and a movie as well called The 37th Parallel, which will be out next year, which is a really wild, true story about a guy who is known as the Mulder of El Paso. He's a sheriff's deputy in in Colorado, El Paso, Colorado, who became obsessed with UFOs. And it's not about UFOs, but it's really more like Close Encounters. This obsession kind of became his life. He has a couple kids, he gets an RV, and on his days off, he takes them off to UFO sites where people have seen UFOs to investigate. They check into a motel, and he gets his Glock and goes out in the middle of the night to look for UFOs. And while doing this, he kind of uncovered something really bizarre. And it ties all the way into the CIA and all the things that we've heard about and all the bizarre conspiracy things, but it all comes back to the simple story of this guy and his family and what he uncovered. I don't want to give too much away because this is really early, but that's going to be the next project for me, and I'm working on that over the summer. So, anybody else? Good.
Is that fiction or not?
True story. He's the real Close Encounters. I mean, it's a story that will really be mind-boggling to a lot of people because what he discovered, it's very clearly that something bizarre is going on, but what it is still, undecided. But it's really interesting. I'll give you one little snippet. Whenever the FAA gets a report of a UFO sighting by a pilot, that information is actually sent to a private company, an aeronautics company that actually makes gaskets for the International Space Station. This company funds a UFO response team. And so that's all true. So just think about that for a second. That's bizarre. And yet that is something that is, part of this story. So there is something going on, but it's not necessarily, UFOs and aliens and stuff like that. But there is a lot of money and a lot of interest in these bizarre things. And I think that that's fascinating, for whatever reason it might be. Sure. Awesome. Well, listen, I figure thank you so much. This was great. I'll hang out here and sign whatever you want. And if anybody has any questions up front and personal, I'm good to go. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.